A royal guard received direct orders to stand down, to stay silent, to let security handle everything, no matter what happened. And for a while he did comply, until he saw the flash of something silver just beneath a suit jacket, heading straight toward the youngest royal in the entire courtyard. He didn't wait for permission, and within seconds a man was on the ground. A hidden blade had been kicked away, and the guard was being stripped of rank in front of the press, the diplomats, and the royal family themselves. But just as he turned to leave, a voice cut through the silence. Not an officer, not a commander, a 10-year-old girl with royal blood and perfect clarity. And her words? They changed everything. Now, before we show you exactly what happened that day, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The barracks briefing room at Wellington never felt comfortable, but this morning it felt suffocating. The air hung thick with the smell of fresh leather and boot polish, mixed with something sharper, the kind of tension that settles over soldiers when orders don't match instincts. 30 guardsmen stood in perfect rows, red tunics pressed to regulation sharpness. But beneath the ceremonial stillness, unease rippled through the ranks like a held breath. Captain Morrison paced at the front, his clipboard gripped tight enough to crease the papers. Above him, the regimental crest of the Coldstream Guards watched over proceedings with the same stern authority that had presided over briefings in this room for decades. But today's orders carried a weight that made even the most seasoned guards shift their feet. Lancaster House has requested absolute minimal interference for today's diplomatic walkthrough, Morrison announced, his voice carrying that particular edge officers used when delivering orders they didn't entirely believe in. You will maintain ceremonial stillness regardless of crowd movement or civilian approach. No exceptions. Near the back of the formation, Sergeant Leo Marchand stood with the kind of absolute stillness that came from years of practice and deeper conviction. His scarlet tunic showed the faint wear patterns that marked a soldier who'd earned his place rather than inherited it. Unlike the younger guards around him, Marchand wasn't fighting fidgets or nervous energy. He was listening, calculating. If civilians cross the rope line or approach the ceremonial perimeter, Morrison continued, you are not to engage. Security personnel will respond. Your role is purely symbolic. The word symbolic landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. A few guards exchanged glances. They all knew what Lancaster House meant. Senior royals, foreign dignitaries, the kind of event where one wrong move could make headlines in 6 countries by evening. Marchand took a single step forward. The sound of his boots on polished floorboards cut through the morning stillness with unmistakable authority. With respect, sir, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that made other men listen. What happens if it's not some tourist with a selfie stick? What if it's an actual threat? Morrison stopped pacing. The room went dead quiet. You are not paid to interpret threats, Sergeant. You are paid to stand where you're placed and look the part. This isn't Helmand Province. Marchand met his gaze without blinking. Everyone in that room knew his record. 2 tours in Afghanistan, a chest full of commendations, and the kind of reputation that made younger soldiers want to serve beside him. But Morrison pressed on, his voice hardening. Your assignment today is visibility and posture, nothing more, not judgment calls, not heroics. Something shifted in Marchand's expression. Not anger, but the cold clarity of a man reaching the limits of what he could accept. And if someone moves on the royal family while I'm standing there playing statue? What does this uniform mean then? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Morrison's jaw tightened. It means you followed orders, which is more than I can say for what you're doing right now. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for final warnings. I'll make this crystal clear, Sergeant Marchand. Defiance today will cost you your commission. Do I make myself understood? Marchand held his ground for a long moment, weighing duty against orders, conscience against career. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady as bedrock. Crystal, sir. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Morrison clapped his clipboard shut with unnecessary force. Dismissed to positions. Final equipment checks in 10 minutes. As the guards filed out in measured steps, boots echoing against ancient floors, Marchand remained at the back of the formation. He wasn't angry. Anger was wasteful, emotional, the kind of luxury professional soldiers couldn't afford. He was thinking, planning, understanding that sometimes the hardest choice wasn't between right and wrong, but between different kinds of duty. Outside the barracks windows, Westminster's morning bells began their timeless chimes, each note carrying across London with the authority of centuries. But inside that briefing room, tradition and conscience had just declared war on each other. And Sergeant Leo Marchand was about to find out which one would win. Leo Marchand hadn't grown up wanting to wear a uniform. He'd grown up watching his father return from 25 years in the Royal Anglian Regiment with calloused hands, a straight back, and an unshakable belief that some things mattered more than comfort. Their 2 up, 2 down outside Leeds wasn't much to look at, but it was built on principles that didn't bend with convenience. His mother ran a market stall in Otley, up before dawn every morning regardless of weather, because that's what you did when people counted on you. His father never talked much about his service, but he taught Leo the difference between following orders and understanding why they mattered. Anyone can stand where they're told, he'd say, while polishing boots that hadn't seen action in years. Takes a different kind of man to know when standing isn't enough. By 19, Leo had joined 2 Para. Not because a recruiter promised him adventure or benefits, but because he wanted to serve somewhere that decisions carried weight. Afghanistan came quickly after that. Helmand Province taught him lessons that most men never learned and fewer still lived to apply. That hesitation killed people, that protocol was useful until it wasn't, and that the difference between discipline and paralysis was often measured in heartbeats. The IED that nearly ended everything came during a routine patrol sweep outside Sangjin. Leo had spotted the glint of pressure wire beneath the dust, saw the civilian cart rolling straight toward it, and made the kind of split-second decision that defined careers and lives. He stepped between the device and the innocents, took most of the blast into his back and spine, spent 6 months learning to walk properly again. They told him he was done. Medical boards, career counsellors, well-meaning officers, all of them suggested he'd given enough, earned his discharge, deserved to go home and find something easier. Leo had listened politely, then requested transfer to ceremonial duty instead. Most soldiers would have seen it as a step down. Leo saw it differently. The red tunic wasn't a costume, it was a promise. A visible reminder that some people still believed honour meant something. If the public couldn't see real discipline and genuine commitment in their guards, then the uniform became theatre instead of service. He'd transferred to the Coldstream Guards with nothing to prove and no interest in climbing ranks. Other guards rotated through and moved on. Leo stayed. He never missed a posting, never cracked during heat waves or downpours, never responded to tourist provocations or photographer intrusions. His fellow guards called him the line, as in the one you didn't cross, the standard you measured yourself against. Leo never smiled at the nickname, but he never rejected it either, because that line, between civilians and royals, between performance and protection, between what was easy and what was right, was sacred to him. He'd seen too many moments where hesitation meant tragedy. Ceremonial guards might not face incoming fire, but when they were needed, they had to be ready to act without permission, without backup, without guarantee of support from above. That readiness wasn't about medals or recognition or advancement. It was about standing exactly where danger might appear and knowing you'd never hesitate when hesitation could cost lives. Even if everyone else was afraid to look wrong while doing right. From the outside, nothing particularly important was happening at Lancaster House that Tuesday morning. No fanfare, no press lines, no ceremonial carriages rolling through gates watched by thousands. To the casual observers strolling through Green Park, it looked like just another quiet diplomatic day. A few guards on rotation, some internal movements between embassy buildings, the kind of routine business that kept London's royal machinery humming without much public attention. But inside the security perimeter, something significant was unfolding. A private diplomatic walkthrough involving multiple foreign dignitaries and select members of the royal family. Not just the working royals who handled most public engagements, but younger family members too, including Princess Charlotte. She stood quietly in the morning light, 10 years old but carrying herself with the composed attention that marked her as unmistakably royal. Her charcoal pea coat was perfectly tailored, her navy tights without a wrinkle, dark hair arranged with the precision that suggested serious adult supervision. But her focus was entirely her own, watching the guards with the intensity of someone who understood she was witnessing something important rather than merely decorative. This wasn't Charlotte's first ceremonial appearance, but it was her first behind-the-scenes diplomatic tour, where she was meant to observe protocol and learn statecraft without drawing attention to herself. Everything about the morning had been designed for minimal visibility. Guards had received explicit instructions to avoid interaction. Internal cameras were disabled. Even the walking route had been shifted away from the main tourist area, where phones might capture unguarded moments. The Royal Protection Unit called it a movement light engagement. One of the palace aides had been more direct. No drama, no friction, no headlines. "We can't afford another security story after last week's tabloid nonsense." The instructions to the ceremonial guards had been blunt, remain purely symbolic, unless directly commanded otherwise. No sudden movements, no escalation, no eye contact that might suggest active engagement rather than decorative presence. Marchand hated every word of it. He understood the politics. Palace communications were always managing some crisis or scandal, trying to project competence while avoiding the kind of dramatic imagery that sold newspapers. But you didn't post armed guards at security perimeters if you intended them to ignore breaches. The logic was backwards. Maximum visibility of security presence, minimum actual security response. He took his assigned position anyway, 10 meters inside the rope line that separated the ceremonial area from the public walkways. To his right, a younger guardsman adjusted his rifle angle with the nervous precision of someone still learning that ceremony and readiness weren't contradictory. Across the courtyard, diplomatic liaisons fussed over schedules while aides whispered updates into concealed microphones. The morning sun slanted through the ancient trees, casting long shadows across cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of similar gatherings. From somewhere beyond the main buildings, the regimental band continued their warm-up rehearsals, muted trumpet calls echoing off stone walls with the kind of timeless authority that made tourists stop walking and listen without quite knowing why. That's when Marchand noticed the man. He separated himself from the public walkway with the kind of casual confidence that immediately set off every alarm bell Marchand's training had installed. Well-dressed, unhurried, moving with the deliberate ease of someone who expected to be allowed wherever he chose to go. No camera, no tourist map, no visible credentials, just purposeful movement toward the ceremonial perimeter. Most concerning of all, he wasn't heading toward the diplomatic cluster where foreign dignitaries were being guided through formal introductions. He was walking straight toward the area where Princess Charlotte stood with her aide, politely listening to explanations about naval insignia displays. Marchand's posture didn't change, but his awareness sharpened to the crystalline focus that had kept him alive in places where inattention meant death. The man moved like he belonged there. That was the problem. Too confident, too directed, too familiar with security layouts for someone who should have been stopped at the outer checkpoint. And as the man's jacket shifted with his stride, Marchand caught the unmistakable glint of something metallic beneath the fabric. Something that didn't belong in a diplomatic receiving area. Something flat, long, and deliberately concealed. The man was 30 feet from Princess Charlotte now. 25. Her protection officer was still focused on the main diplomatic group, too far away to intervene quickly if intervention became necessary. Everyone else was looking in the wrong direction. Everyone except the guardsman who had just been ordered to stand still and let others handle anything that might happen. The man moved with practiced confidence, each step calculated to appear casual while covering ground efficiently. No nervous glances, no hesitation, no acknowledgement of the ceremonial guards, whose presence should have at least warranted some recognition. He walked like someone who had studied the layout, timed the patrols, understood exactly when and how to approach without triggering immediate response. Marchand tracked his movement without shifting his ceremonial stance, but his mind was working at combat speed. The trajectory was unmistakable, straight toward Princess Charlotte, who remained focused on her aide's explanation of regimental history, unaware that anything unusual was developing behind her. At 15 feet, the man's hand drifted toward his jacket in a movement that looked absent-minded but felt purposeful. Marchand caught another flash of metal, longer than a phone, flatter than a pen, shaped exactly like the folding knives he'd seen too often in places where such weapons weren't carried for opening packages or cutting rope. One of the guards, 2 positions over, had noticed the approach as well. Marchand could see it in his peripheral vision, a slight stiffening, a barely perceptible shift in attention. But the younger man was caught between the morning's explicit orders and his growing unease, frozen in the kind of indecision that turned dangerous situations fatal. An aide near the main archway murmured into her radio, "Unknown male approaching the perimeter." "Is he cleared?" The response crackled back immediately. "Looks familiar. Probably diplomatic staff. Let it proceed." That was the moment Marchand understood that protocol was about to fail. The man wasn't on any cleared list. He wasn't diplomatic staff. He was something else entirely, and the only people who seemed to recognize that were the guards, who had just been ordered not to act on their recognition. 10 feet now. Princess Charlotte turned slightly, sensing movement nearby, but not yet alarmed. Her aide looked over casually, saw a well-dressed man in the kind of expensive clothing that suggested official status, and returned to her explanation without The man's fingers brushed his jacket again, and this time Marchand saw not just the outline of the concealed weapon, but the subtle adjustment in the man's stance that indicated he was preparing to use it. The approach phase was ending. The action phase was about to begin. And the only person positioned to prevent it was the soldier who had just been threatened with court-martial for considering such intervention. Marchand's boots struck cobblestone with the sharp finality of a decision that couldn't be undone. The sound cut across the morning quiet like a shot, stopping conversations mid-sentence and turning every head in the ceremonial area. Cameras that had been casually documenting diplomatic handshakes swung toward the unexpected movement. Even the distant band faltered for a half-beat before their training kicked in and they resumed their rehearsal. A royal guard had broken formation. Without command, without permission, without precedent. Marchand moved with the fluid economy of muscle memory trained under fire. 3 measured steps put him directly in the man's path, close enough to act but not so close as to escalate unnecessarily. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority when he spoke. "That's far enough, sir." The man stopped, but his expression remained pleasant, almost amused. The kind of smile politicians wore when cameras were rolling and everything had to look normal, regardless of what was actually happening. His hand stayed near his jacket. "I'm expected," he said smoothly, as if Marchand were hotel security rather than an armed soldier. "Please, step aside." Marchand didn't move. "You'll wait for proper clearance." That's when the man made his mistake. Instead of producing credentials or calling for his supposed escort, his hand moved deliberately into his jacket, not fast enough to suggest panic, but purposeful enough to signal that he had decided conversation was over. Marchand's response was immediate and devastating. His left hand shot forward with surgical precision, clamping over the man's wrist before the concealed weapon could be fully drawn. A controlled twist, a pivot using the man's own momentum against him, and the intruder dropped hard to one knee as something metallic clattered across the ancient stones. A folding knife, half opened, gleamed against the pale cobblestones in the morning sun. Gasps erupted from the diplomatic cluster. Princess Charlotte had stepped back instinctively, her aide finally understanding that something serious was happening. But Charlotte herself wasn't looking at the man on the ground or the weapon at his feet. She was watching Marchand with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was learning something important about courage and timing. "Weapon confirmed," Marchand announced clearly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Subject restrained." Palace security finally surged forward from their positions near the main buildings, but they were arriving to secure a situation that had already been resolved. The real threat had been neutralized by the guard who wasn't supposed to act. As they dragged the intruder to his feet, he was muttering protests about misunderstandings and diplomatic immunity, but the blade on the ground made his intentions unmistakable. Background checks would later reveal no official status, no legitimate business at Lancaster House, and surveillance photos of royal movements dating back several weeks. Marchand remained at parade rest, rifle properly positioned, bearing unchanged, despite the blood trickling from where the man's desperate swing had caught his jaw. To any observer, he looked exactly like what the tourists expected, an immovable symbol of duty and discipline. But Princess Charlotte knew better. She had just witnessed something that no amount of ceremony could fake, the difference between wearing a uniform and earning it. The reprimands came swiftly, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested extensive experience in managing situations that weren't supposed to happen. Major Christopher Blackwood arrived within minutes, his face set in the expression of a career officer who understood that headlines were more dangerous than hidden knives. Behind him trailed a communications specialist clutching a tablet that was undoubtedly already buzzing with media inquiries about unusual activity at Lancaster House. "Sergeant Marchand," Blackwood said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with parade ground authority. "Step forward." Marchand moved to attention position, but his eyes remained steady, unrepentant. Behind him, the knife was still being photographed by investigators who had found additional surveillance materials in the intruder's pockets. "You were given explicit orders regarding engagement protocols," Blackwood continued. "Those orders were violated in full view of foreign dignitaries and potential media coverage." The communications specialist leaned forward to whisper something urgent about optics management and damage control narratives. Blackwood nodded grimly. "The security breach was contained by existing protocols," he announced loudly enough for nearby witnesses to hear. "This incident will be reviewed as a training exercise that exceeded parameters." Marchand's jaw tightened. A training exercise. The blade on the ground, the surveillance photos, the man who had walked uninvited toward a 10-year-old princess. All of it reduced to a convenient fiction that would keep headlines manageable. "With respect, sir," Marchand said quietly, "if I had waited for existing protocols to contain the situation, we would be having a very different conversation." Blackwood's eyes flashed with warning. "You were ordered to maintain ceremonial posture regardless of circumstances. You chose to interpret those orders according to your personal judgment rather than military discipline. I chose to protect a member of the royal family when no one else was positioned to act." The words hung in the morning air like a challenge to everything the institution valued more than its fundamental purpose. Blackwood stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for final warnings. "Your personal opinions about threat assessment are not relevant to ceremonial duty. You embarrassed the regiment, disrupted diplomatic proceedings, and created exactly the kind of incident we were tasked to prevent." Princess Charlotte, who had been standing quietly with her aide throughout the exchange, suddenly stepped forward. Her voice cut through the tension with surprising authority. "Excuse me." Every head turned. The 10-year-old who was supposed to be observing silently had decided the adults needed correction. "That man was walking directly toward me," she said clearly, her young voice carrying the kind of composure that suggested she had been thinking carefully about what needed to be said. No one else moved to stop him. No one else even seemed to notice. Blackwood opened his mouth to respond, probably with something about internal review processes and appropriate channels. Charlotte continued before he could speak. "I saw what he had in his jacket." Sergeant Marchand saw it too. Everyone else was looking somewhere else. She turned to address Marchand directly, her gaze steady and grateful. "You moved when no one else would. You saw the danger when everyone else was worried about looking proper. The courtyard had gone completely silent. Even the distant band had stopped their rehearsal. The communications specialist was typing furiously on her tablet, probably crafting statements that would somehow explain why a child was correcting senior military officers about threat assessment. Charlotte looked back at Blackwood with the kind of direct attention that reminded everyone present exactly whose family she belonged to. "I want to give a formal instruction," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable cadence of command rather than request. "Restore his position." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. "Your Highness, military discipline requires—" "It requires protecting people," Charlotte interrupted politely but firmly. "That's what he did. That's what guards are supposed to do, isn't it?" The question carried the weight of centuries of royal authority, condensed into the clear logic of a child who had just learned the difference between following rules and serving their purpose. Blackwood looked around the courtyard, at the diplomatic witnesses, at the security personnel, at the communications specialist, whose expression suggested she was calculating political ramifications in real time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge of reproach. "Sergeant Marchand," he said formally, "return to your post." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an acknowledgement that the orders had been wrong, or that the situation had required exactly the kind of judgment they had tried to prohibit. But it was recognition that some authorities transcended military hierarchy. Marchand straightened, placed his bearskin hat back on his head with ceremonial precision, and walked back to his position on the rope line. Not because he had been vindicated by his superiors, but because the one person whose safety had justified his action had made it clear that protection mattered more than protocol. As he resumed his stance, rifle angled correctly, posture perfect, eyes forward, Princess Charlotte walked past his position with her aide. She paused for just a moment, long enough to meet his gaze and say quietly, "Thank you for seeing what needed to be done." Marchand's response was the crispest salute of his entire ceremonial career. Not the mechanical acknowledgement of rank, but the genuine respect of one person who understood duty saluting another who had just learned its true meaning. The morning resumed its ceremonial rhythm, but something fundamental had changed. The diplomatic walk-through continued with tighter security and more attentive guards. The band played their rehearsals with renewed precision. Tourists beyond the rope line sensed that they had witnessed something significant, even if they didn't understand exactly what. But those who had been there understood. They had seen the moment when tradition and conscience collided, and conscience had won. They had watched a 10-year-old princess demonstrate more courage than the adults around her, and a guardsman proved that some duties transcended orders. In the weeks that followed, Sergeant Leo Marchand continued his ceremonial duties with the same quiet professionalism that had always marked his service. But other guards looked at him differently now, not just as a reliable colleague, but as the man who had chosen action over safety when action was what the situation demanded. Princess Charlotte attended several more ceremonial events that season. She always watched the guards with particular attention, understanding now that their stillness wasn't emptiness, but readiness. Their silence wasn't indifference, but vigilance. When she passed Marchand's position, she would sometimes give the smallest nod of recognition, acknowledgement that they shared an understanding about when rules served their purpose, and when purpose required breaking rules. The official reports described the Lancaster House incident as a training exercise that exceeded parameters. The communications team crafted statements about robust security protocols and coordinated response procedures. Media inquiries were deflected with bureaucratic efficiency that turned potential headlines into administrative footnotes. But the truth lived on in the memories of those who had been there, in the quiet conversations between guards about what they owed to tradition and what they owed to the people they were sworn to protect. In the way security protocols were quietly updated to acknowledge that sometimes split-second decisions couldn't wait for committee approval. In the example of a 10-year-old girl who had understood instinctively what the adults around her had forgotten, that authority without purpose was just performance, and that the highest duty was always to those who needed protection most. The morning sun continued to slant through ancient trees, casting shadows across cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of similar moments when individual courage had proven more valuable than institutional caution. The ceremonies continued with their timeless precision, but everyone understood they were witnessing something real. Not just pageantry, but the living embodiment of principles that still mattered when lives hung in the balance. And at his post on the rope line, Sergeant Leo Marchand stood with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had discovered that sometimes the greatest service came not from following orders, but from understanding why those orders existed in the first place, and having the courage to act when they no longer served their purpose. What would you have done if you'd seen that man approaching Princess Charlotte with a concealed weapon? Would you have broken ranks to intervene, knowing it could end your career? And do you think Charlotte was right to overrule the officers who wanted to punish the guard who protected her? Sometimes the most important commands don't come from the chain of authority. They come from the people who understand what duty really means. Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every single one. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our daily uploads. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes that doing right matters more than looking right. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves courage doesn't always wear stripes.